Hello everyone. In the comments on previous videos, many of you asked me to make a video where I talk about array methods and how they actually work. So, in this lesson, we will talk about it. Let's start by looking at a very simple task. We have an array called people, an array consisting of objects where each element is an object, and we need to iterate over it somehow. How do we do this in the usual way? Well, for this we have at least two loops that allow us to do it. This is a for loop where, let's say, on each iteration we create some index. Let's say I equals 0. Next, we iterate until I is greater than the length of the given array that we are iterating over. Then, we increment our index. And now we can, for example, output some element to console log. That is, we refer to the array and then to its index I. This is the most familiar form that we usually use. If we look, we basically get the expected result. That is, on each iteration, a separate object is output to console log. JavaScript also has a while loop, which can essentially do the same thing, but I wanted to show another loop that is more related to the for loop, and it is called forOf. That is, we can also use the keyword for, create a variable, for example, person, on each iteration, and then use the keyword to specify which array we are iterating over. In our case, this is the array people. Next, we will repeat the logic and output the variable person to the console log, and I will comment out the first loop. If we refresh the page, we will get the same result. Essentially, we have two identical entries. The first entry will work on a larger number of browsers because it is ES5 syntax. This syntax, however, pertains to ES6, but in addition to the standard for loops in JavaScript, each array has so-called higher order functions that we can just use, and let's take a look at them. I have already mentioned in the comments which methods we will be considering, so let's start with the forEach method. We refer to the array itself and then call a method on it called forEach. It translates literally as we are doing some iteration for each element. And, essentially, this loop, this method, it takes a parameter function. For now, I will write it in ES5 syntax. This function takes three parameters. The first parameter is a person object, meaning each object in this array. The second parameter is a certain index, and, accordingly, the third parameter will be the array itself, people. Let's say I'll write people array here. Now, to iterate over each element and generally look at each element, we can simply refer to the first parameter that this callback takes. And if we look in the console log, we won't see any difference. But if you compare this method, for example, with the first for loop, you can see how much more concise and elegant this syntax is. Certainly, we now have additional parameters, but we can simplify this code. And now we will look at how we can do that. For now, let's also log the index and the array itself to the console to check that these parameters are working as expected. Indeed, we see many logs in the console. The first parameter is each current object, followed by the index starting from 0, and then the array itself. However, the last parameter is rarely used, and the index is also used quite infrequently. Therefore, you will mostly see a similar pattern where we just log each element to the console, and the result will be exactly the same. But with the use of ES6 syntax, specifically with the use of arrow functions, we can significantly shorten this code. So, basically, let me copy this. I will comment this out. We can also pass an arrow function to the forEach method, where we get a person object on each iteration. And considering that our function is written in one line, we can remove the curly braces altogether and write it this way. If we update, we won't see any difference. That is, now, I think the difference between the first for loop and this kind of notation is obvious. This one is more understandable. There are no indices, square brackets, and everything is written in one line. Yes, definitely. In this context, the for loop also looks good, but nevertheless, we are writing everything here in one line. Let's move on. The next method we will look at is called map. The map method essentially works similarly to the forEach method, meaning it takes exactly the same parameters. The three parameters are the element itself, the index, and the array we are iterating over. But it works a bit differently. With the map method, we can create new arrays and, as a result, store them in a new variable. For example, I will create a variable new people, and I will refer to the people array and call the map method on it. Here I can also pass the keyword function, but we will use ES6 syntax. So on each iteration, I will get a person object. And here it is very important for me to return something. So, for example, I will just return the person object here. I will write it in this format. And let's log the new people array to the console. If we refresh the page, we will see the same array we started with. Because we are just iterating over the entire array and directly returning the object itself. But the map method is great because we can transform this data in any way and store it in a new resulting array. As a basic example, we can not even tie it to the person object, but instead return the string hello. So for each object in the people array, we will transform it into a new string hello. And as a result, we will get an array consisting of 6 hello strings. It looks cool, but it's not very practical. What is really practical is that we can operate on this object. And, for example, we can get some data from it or transform it in some way. So, let's say we can get the names of all the people in this array. For example, by referring to the person object in its name field. If we refresh the page, we now get an array in new people consisting of strings where each element is represented as the name of the person we need. In a similar way, we can get any data from these objects. We can get them, or rather, we can transform them in any way. Let's consider the next format. We can, for example, return a string. With templating, and for instance, first output person name, and then, for example, in parentheses, we can output personage. By the way, we can also write this function in one line here because it consists of a single return statement. So we can get rid of it, remove the curly braces, and just write it like this. Now, if we refresh the page, we get a new array where each element is represented as a string, and the string consists of a name with the age written in parentheses. Also, we can, for example, operate with numbers. For example, we can return person.age multiplied by, say, 3. This can also be done, and as a result, we will get an array consisting of numbers, where each element is multiplied by 3 based on the person's age. So, this is how the map method works, and it is used to transform the current array into a new array. Alright, now let's look at the next method, which is called filter. And the filter method is used to filter the original array based on some specific criteria. Let's start by tackling the following task. We have an initial array, and let's say we want to filter out those people who can currently, for example, by alcohol. So we have Elena, who is 17 years old, and Mikhail, who is 15 years old. So ideally, we need to automatically get rid of them and end up with an array consisting of people who are over 18 years old. How would we do this in the usual form? That is, using a simple basic for loop. Let's take a look. So on each iteration, we create a variable, for example, and we go up to the length of the people array. Increment the index, then let's create a new array here. Let's say I'll call it adults. There will be an empty array, and in the for loop, we will check if the element of the people array at index I has an age field that is greater than or equal to 18, meaning the person is already an adult. If so, we will add the people at index I to the adults array using the push method. Otherwise, we will do nothing. Now, If we look at the array of adults in the console, we will see that we get 4 elements, and indeed, each of these people is over 18 years old. This is the task we wanted to accomplish. But such a record is quite long, so let me comment it out and show how the filter method can help us implement similar functionality. I will also create an array of adults and then refer to the array of people and call the filter method on it. The filter method also takes 3 parameters, meaning the first parameter is the element itself that we are iterating over, then it is the index, and finally the array itself. So here I will write that in each iteration I get a person object, and essentially, here I need to return either true or false if I want to keep this element in the array of adults. So here I can also ask if .age is basically greater than or equal to 18, then I essentially return. And let's look at the array of adults in the console. I refresh the page, and we also get 4 elements here. So now you can already see the difference between the old format and using the filter method. But in reality, we can significantly shorten such a statement and write it using the full functionality of arrow functions. That is, essentially, we just need to return these conditions, so I can get rid of everything I wrote and return it in this format. That is, here an arrow function is written, here we have a parameter being accepted, and then we return the condition that if the person's age is greater than or equal to 18, then we keep them in the array, and if we refresh the page, the result is exactly the same. That is, now you can clearly compare this record and the one-liner. Moreover, in interviews or at work, the more often you use such methods that are relevant to the current context, and the more concisely you write them, the more it speaks to your competence and your ability to work with code. So keep these methods in mind. They are very useful in practice. Now, let's continue. And next, we have a rather unusual method called reduce. It stands out a bit from the previous methods we have considered. And essentially, it serves to obtain some final value by iterating over some array. Let's consider some basic example. Let's say each of the people in the given array has a budget field, which indicates the budget that the current person possesses. And let's assume we have a task to calculate the total budget of these people. In other words, roughly speaking, to sum up each of these budgets. I think that using a for loop will make this quite simple. Let's see how it works in general. We also iterate over the array of people. Somewhere here, for example, I will create a variable amount which is initially set to 0. And then on each iteration, I will reassign amount plus equals people at index I and its budget field. If we look at the variable amount in the console, we should get some sum, that is 122,500 units. However, with the reduce method, we can replicate similar functionalities but do it more comfortably. Let's comment this out again, and essentially, we first create a variable amount, essentially. Next, we make an assignment and iterate through the people array using the reduce method. The reduce method takes 2 parameters. The first parameter is a callback, which also takes 2 parameters. The first parameter is total, and the second parameter is the iterable element of the array. The second parameter in the reduce method is an initial value that will be assigned to the variable total. That is, we want to calculate the total budget of people, so we start from 0, as in the example above. And, essentially, what do we need to do in the reduce method? We need to return some modified value. In essence, we essentially need to assign the variable total, which by default initially equals 0, the budget of the person, in order to proceed. If we look at the result now, we get exactly the same value. Moreover, we can also write this method in one line, meaning we can cut it from here, remove the curly braces, and write it this way. And the result will be exactly the same. In essence, the idea of the reduce method is very simple. On each track, we change this value, which is visible on every track, and it will be mutable. And when we iterate over any element, we use its values to change this global value and, of course, assign some default value. For example, if the default value is 200,000, then the result will be 200,000 more. I also want to show you two more useful methods that are very often used in practice and are used to search for specific elements. The first one is the find method. It is used to find a specific element based on a condition. That is, suppose I also refer to the people array and call the find method on it, which in turn takes a callback function where we accept the iterated object as the first parameter, in our case, a person. And let's say we want to find a person whose name is, for example, Igor. That is, we want to find Igor. How will we do this? We will simply and clearly write that we are interested in the person whose name field equals the string Igor. And, as a result, we will store all of this in a variable, for example, Igor. Now, if we look at it in the console, we should see it. We update, and indeed, we get that object, the only object that meets such a condition. The findIndex method works in a similar way. Let's take a look at how it's done. That is, it works exactly the same as the find method. We pass a certain condition into it, but at the output, we get the index. The method is called index, and let's just simply create a variable here called IgorIndex. If I save it, we get 2 here. And indeed, if we look, this is the 0th element, this is the first element, and this is the second element. So, the index has been found correctly. Thus, we can search for any elements, either their direct value or their index, and perform operations that allow us to either filter, modify, or calculate some overall value of arrays, and so on. At the end of this video, which is now, I want to show you, in principle, how you can use these methods together. Let me write a comment here to logically separate, and let's solve a very simple task. That is, first we want to go through the people array, for example, using a method like filter. And let's filter the people, say, by their budget. That is, let's say we are only interested in those people who have a budget of more than 3,000 rubles. How do we do this? We accept an object here called person, and certainly, you can name this object whatever you like. And here we specify the condition that we are only interested in those persons whose budget field is greater than 3,000. Next, the filter method returns a new array. And therefore, we can immediately call another method on it, for example, map. Because this value will return an array, and arrays have a map method. So, let's see what we can do with it. That is, for example, we can bring them to a certain format. Let's come up with such a task. That is, on each iteration, we also get a person object, and, for example, we will modify this object, so now we will have a new array, consisting of another type of objects. Let's say it will have an info field, where we will store some value, say. Let's just write in literals person, for example, name, and in parentheses will be the value person, for example, age. And we will also definitely need the budget field here. For example, the budget, let's say, will be equal to the old value of the person budget. So, this is how it can be done. Let's put all of this into the resulting array for now, for example, into new people in. See it in the console. New people. If we refresh the page, we have 4 elements, and now it is visible that each of the objects is already presented in a different format. That is, it does not have a name field, but it has an info field containing parameters such as name and age, yes, the ones we displayed. That is, You can also transform objects in this way. Or, for example, with the mat method, we can also call the reduce method afterward to calculate the total budget as we did before. Here we will have the variable amount, and in the reduce method, we accept a callback and an initial value. Here we have the parameters total and person, and we will simply calculate the total value as total plus person budget. Let's refresh the page. There is nothing because we are not logging the amount to the console amount. Refresh the page and we get some new value. If we, for example, perform some manipulation here in the map method, say, refer to the global math object and, for instance, do something unusual like take the square root of the budget and then calculate the total budget values, we will get some new value here. In the map method, we transform these data in any way we want. And interestingly, this notation is called a chain. It is preferable to write each method on a new line when using a chain to make it more readable. We see that with each of these functions, we get an array as a result, and accordingly, we can also call the methods of this array, such as the map method, the reduce method, and so on. However, the reduce method returns a number in this case, so we do not continue the chain of these calls here. I hope it is now much clearer to you how these methods work and how you can use them in your practice. So, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like, leave comments, and we will see you in other videos.